Welcome to the flip lesson for 2.01, Europe Reborn, Discovering Greece and Rome. This goes along with your student guide pages 18 and 19. Lesson Introduction. Most Europeans lost touch with the classical world in the centuries after the fall of Rome. When trade declined, they also lost touch with each other and with Asia. But in Italy, there were constant reminders of the past. People walked by the Colosseum and beneath the great aqueducts. Scholars still read classical works. When the plague subsided and trade picked up in the 14th century, Italian artists, scholars, and authors eagerly combined the best of the classics with new ideas. Rich merchants helped them make the Renaissance an incredible period of cultural achievement. During the 14th century, Western Europeans developed a renewed interest in the ancient Greek and Roman civilizations. The rebirth of interest in classical learning sparked a period of tremendous creativity that lasted until the early 17th century. We know that period as the Renaissance. Italian geniuses like Dante, Giotto, and Petrarch forged the way with innovative ideas that gave Europeans a new understanding of human worth and potential. Lesson objectives. What you should be able to do when you finish this lesson. Define the Renaissance as a period of artistic and literary achievement in Europe from the late 14th to the early 17th centuries, inspired by new interest in the classics. Explain the word Renaissance and it means rebirth. Identify Giotto as a 14th century Italian painter who introduced lifelike figures to painting. Define humanism as a movement that stressed the wisdom of the classics and the dignity of humans and human potential. Describe Dante's Divine Comedy as significant for introducing realistic characters to literature and being written in Italian rather than Latin. Identify Dante as the 14th century Italian poet who wrote the Divine Comedy. Identify Petrarch as the 14th century Italian scholar known as the father of humanism, and review historical events. The Renaissance. The Renaissance is an important period in the history of Europe that lasted from the late 1300s to the early 1600s. It was a time of extraordinary artistic and literary creativity inspired by new interest in classical civilization. The Divine Comedy is known as one of the greatest books of all time. Dante's masterpiece tells the story of a spiritual journey from the depths of despair to extreme peace in heaven. Dante, a poet and a philosopher. Dante grew up in the Italian city-state of Florence. Dante began writing epic poetry when he was banished from Florence and could not return. He turned his exile into a life of writing. Dante was inspired by the writing of the classical Roman poets Livy, Cicero, and Virgil. Virgil is Dante's guide in the first two parts of the Divine Comedy. Dante's epic poem, The Divine Comedy, reflected Christian beliefs during the Middle Ages. Dante's journey in the Divine Comedy showed a deep Christian faith in life after death. Most medieval Christians saw life as a trial to be endured and heaven as the goal of earthly strivings. The language of the Divine Comedy was different from other philosophical works of the Middle Ages. All philosophical works in the Middle Ages were written in Latin. Dante wrote in Italian. The popularity of Dante's epic poem helped make the Florentine dialect become what we now know as Italian. Dante's characters were different from other early medieval poems. In most medieval literature, characters were abstract figures representing virtues or vices, such as knowledge or envy. Dante peopled the Divine Comedy with rich characters that were vividly described like real people. Giotto, medieval artist. Like most medieval artists, Giotto usually chose religious subject matter. Medieval art depicted people as flat, with little expression or individual personality. Giotto's painting of people were different. In Giotto's paintings, people were more rounded and lifelike. Each person was an individual with his or her own realistic characteristics. Giotto painted his subjects in realistic settings, and the faces of the subjects revealed recognizable human emotions. Petrarch is an Italian scholar and poet. Petrarch's father wanted him to become a lawyer, but Petrarch was more interested in nature, poetry, and literature. Scholars in Petrarch's time were discovering translations of classical works that had been lost for centuries. classic texts coming from when Spanish and Portuguese armies drove the Moors from the Iberian Peninsula. Christian scholars inherited Muslim libraries full of classical manuscripts. Other manuscripts had been in monasteries all along. Petrarch worked for the papal court and gained new insight. As Petrarch traveled around working for the Pope, he was able to search for missing classical Roman texts and other ancient manuscripts. He hated the corruption of the papal court. Petrarch believed wisdom from the ancient thinkers of Greece and Rome could restore virtue and learning to a corrupt Christendom. Humanism, the new education program. Petrarch proposed a new educational program that emphasized the classics. It became known as humanism. Humanism emphasized the value of the classics and involved the search for virtue, truth, and knowledge. Humanism stressed the dignity of man and placed confidence in human potential. Petrarch held both a Christian view and a classical view of the world without conflict. Petrarch believed the works of classical writers who were not Christian could help educate good Christians. He believed that the respect for human abilities and potential that the classic writers demonstrated could teach a path to virtue. Petrarch thought God had endowed human beings with the ability and freedom to accomplish great things until they passed on to the next life. What did Dante, Giotto, and Petrarch have in common that set them apart from most scholars and artists of their time? They were all medieval men who studied classical art and literature, incorporated classical ideas in their work, and broke with medieval traditions. The end. 5 enemies of peace inhabit with us: avarice, ambition, envy, anger, and pride. If these were to be banished, we should infallibly enjoy perpetual peace. The end, and thank you for joining me.